So one of the things that I think, and that's rendering, so that's a good thing.
Yeah. We can see the slide and see the recording.
Okay. Now for something completely different, reasonable security. Sorry about that. So as I mentioned, we live in an extraordinarily litigious society. We sue better than any other country on earth. And now security is becoming front and center. There's a lot of attorneys, especially on the plaintiff side, that are looking to go ahead and go after companies that have had security incidents. We also have regulations, the CPRA here in California, DFARS, with the cybersecurity maturity model certification that's coming into play with controlled unclassified information, federal contracting information, as well as obviously the recent efforts by the Securities and Exchange Commission. There's a lot of misinformation about what the SEC is looking for. The SEC is not mandating that organizations have good quality security programs. What they're mandating is accurate and complete and transparent disclosure about the status of an organization's security program. So the reality is we have lots of regulations that want us to have good, appropriate security. So a while back, I put together this definition of reasonable security. Reasonable security is that level of security capability that meets the organization's agreed to risk tolerances while fulfilling regulatory requirements and contractual obligations of the organization. I know I've got a couple of friends in here that are CISOs. Is that actionable? The correct response should be hell no. Even though I wrote that. That doesn't do a damn thing. It really doesn't tell us what reasonable security is. And frankly, one of the challenges that we have is we have fundamental disagreements about what level of risk is appropriate within our organizations. So we've got to kind of raise the bar. We have to rethink about how we look at the concept of reasonable security within our companies. There's some challenges that we face. One of them, first and foremost, is that we face infinite risk. There's any number of different things that could come up and effectively get us blindsided that will impact our organizations. And so that's a challenge. As a CISO, we're fundamentally expected to secure everything, every place, all the time in perpetuity. And the reality is that we're resourced with just a finite amount of resources, and we don't have that luxury. So there's really difficult challenges thinking through what risk looks like and what acceptable risk looks like for most organizations. Who in here does mind maps? Hopefully most everybody. But I did one a while back, and I spent literally, this was about a half hour in a mind map, just thinking about all the different components to a security program. So our programs are really complicated. We've got friends here that work in the medical device space. We've got others that work in different areas and industries. Trying to secure devices, applications, programs, making sure employees are doing the right thing, your third-party vendors, how you use cloud infrastructure, all these things in the aggregate are extraordinarily difficult. So there's really almost an infinite attack surface that we're being held to account for. We're also expected to be well-versed on all these different inventories. You know, your endpoints, your applications, your vendors, all of that in the aggregate is really difficult. Think about CIS, the Center for Internet Security, and the critical security controls. 1 and 2 are fundamentally, do we know how to count? And for the vast majority of organizations, the answer is no. You know, we don't know how many endpoints, we don't know how many applications are operating in our environments. We're not necessarily as clear as we would like to be on the number of vendors and third-party relationships that we have, open source software and libraries that are coming into our applications. All these fundamental things are really challenging, and in many cases, simply, we're not doing them as well as we could be. And that's tough stuff, because in most cases, the CISO or the security leaders don't have operational control over this. You know, some of this is infrastructure and operations, some of this is line of business, it's a number of different areas. And then we have what I described when we gave a talk about this up at RSA, are these 3 henchmen. You know, these are fundamentally the most challenging areas in most security programs. How we look at vendor and vendor risk management, vulnerabilities. And now those vulnerabilities are getting into more nuanced areas. You know, log4j. Did anyone even really know what log4j was prior to that occurring? You know, did anyone really appreciate that an update server from a trusted vendor that did network management could end up being compromised by the Russians in that novel technique? So there's challenges there. And then obviously credentials and entitlements. Those are foundationally really difficult. And then ultimately our programs are kind of effectively attested to or evaluated on the quality of our incident response plans. Can we minimize risk for the organization? So this is some of the reasons why security as a discipline, as a practice, is really difficult. One thing to emphasize how tough this is do a pre-mortem. Consider that your organization just got hacked and start asking yourself, what were the conditions precedent that allowed that particular security incident to have occurred? Kind of effectively work backward. And there's a couple of things that I think respectfully end up highlighting those conditions where companies tend to have more significant security issues than those that don't. If we look on the left, when we look at security as an IT issue, that's a red flag. If we look at security as effectively being isolated from the business, you know, oh, go talk to those guys. You know, they're down the hall, they're kind of buried in behind some desks that no one really goes by to visit, all that type of stuff. It's compliance. You know, we're PCI compliant. We've done our HIPAA reviews, things of that nature. Those elements, I think, are very problematic when you look at your security program versus things on the right where the security program is aligned to the business. It's trying to enable and empower things. So we've got those things. But there is a little bit of hope, and I'll kind of highlight this. So we do know, very matter-of-factly, that basic hygiene is really critical. You know, being able to do kind of the basics well tends to improve, you know, the outcomes of our security programs and reduce the likelihood of a material cybersecurity incident. So these are things that we need to do. But fundamentally, and this is important, Gary Hayslip, back when he was CISO at the city of San Diego, one of the things he would do is the proverbial walkabout. He would go out and he would meet with different departments throughout the city and ask them about their programs. What are you doing? You know, he found out, for example, that the library was going to put in an application that was going to collect a fair amount of personal data, and it was all HTTP. There was no kind of, you know, 443 environment to it. Things like that. You can only really get a sense of what's going on in the business if you're engaged. And so you need to figure out structurally, how do you get this collaboration? Most of those folks won't come to us. That means we have to get up out of our chairs and go visit them and be proactive around that. So that is absolutely critical in my view. So I think there's some things, and now I want to kind of flip into really when we look at reasonable security, we're going to do it with a series of questions. We're going to ask, would it be reasonable not to have a given capability, a given function, a given security technology within your operating environment? So identity governance. How often do you do credential reviews? Non-rhetorically. I'll pick on somebody, but just yeah, generally speaking, Ace.
Well, I do it through my password manager.
Yep.
It tells me like what's the health of it, as it's been seen on like packed
Yep.
images, those sorts of things. But that's just very surface.
It is. It is. Let's imagine an organization got compromised and the account that was compromised hadn't been used. It was an inactive account, still enabled, and it was used effectively. Those credentials were found on, you know, some dark website, and that's how the adversary got access to the environment. Would it have been reasonable security not to have disabled that credential, say within 30 days or 60 days or 90 days? Again, think like a plaintiff's attorney. These people are ferocious. They will go after our organizations with the vigor that I don't think any of you may have anticipated unless you've happened to have been on the other side of that. Least privilege, need to know. Going through this list, just looking at these things, you know, how does your organization manage these particular capabilities. So again, is it reasonable not to do these things? The challenge is, and I go back to my point, we face infinite risk, but we have very finite resources. So we're having to go through and make decisions about prioritization. I can't do everything all the time for every app, every vendor, every piece of technology in our operating environment. Where should we spend our time? That's a foundational question. What is it that we don't know that we should know? Why don't we know it? What is it that we're not doing that we should be doing? Why aren't we doing it? Those sorts of things. You know, and I think one of the blissful things, there's folks like, you know, Lucy, you've been an auditor, folks that have done, sorry, I didn't mean to get you as your mid-lunch, but, you know, on the audit side, it's great if you come in on the audit side and say, you have to do this. This regulation requires you to do that. Where you don't have necessarily that impetus, these are challenging issues. Asset management. You know, again, this is CSC 1 and 2, you know, fixed and intangible here. But do you track configuration items? Do you have a configuration management database? Do you know the disposition of your assets? Who the individual is that's tied to using it? All of those things, I think, are extraordinarily important. Software licenses. You know, which titles do you use in your environment? Are they sanctioned? You know, were they formally authorized? Or, you know, Jane or John Doe at a particular business unit just started using them. Thinking through that, what happens if one of those titles ends up being compromised or things of that nature? Vendors. This is a tough area. This is actually the subject of my 5th book that I'm working on with a couple other folks on vendor and supply chain risk management. It is an extraordinarily challenging field. This is not for the faint of heart. The challenge is, you know, how do you look at this? What's your vendor master file? Yesterday for a client, I was helping them out doing a SIG, a standardized information gathering one. It's 380 questions, you know, a couple 8 hours, 12 hours-ish of time to do that. You know, think about the number of vendors, how you do those reviews, or if you're on the receiving end of it, what that's like. You know, what level of due diligence? If you have a third party and they're compromised, did you actually review their security environment? If not, could that be subject to some sort of lawsuit? Those things. One thing that I used to do back when I was CISO at a regional data center is really emphasize service demarcation. You know, where does that provider's services start and stop, and where do yours? What are kind of those areas of tangency? And a lot of times you'll see in service agreements or statements of work, you'll see a roles and responsibilities section, but they're fundamentally not structured the right way. They have, here's the vendor's roles and responsibilities, and here's the client or the user entity's roles and responsibilities. Ideally, it should be at a functional level side by side. So, you know, as the vendor, I do X, as a consumer or the client or user entity, you're doing Y, so that there's less ambiguity about what's actually being done. Program capabilities in terms of vulnerability management. What's scanned? I'm working, Dylan here is a student up at Cal Poly SLO, and he's helping out as an intern this summer, and we're going through KRIs and thinking that through. Vulnerability management is a perfect area for key risk indicators. What assets are actually being scanned? What's the frequency? Do we have good coverage metrics? In other words, if I'm looking at endpoints and I've got 1,000, but I'm only scanning 800, there's a gap there. If I've got applications and I'm looking for issues within the application stack itself, are all those applications or code repositories being reviewed? There's a lot of things in there that need to be reviewed and analyzed. Policies and procedures, do they evidence managerial review and approval? Company has a security issue, here's a security policy. It was reviewed literally in 2021. Would that pass muster? So what's the cadence? You know, who's the owner of it? The structural things within our policies. Can you evidence that employees were trained on that policy, that they understood it? Probably one of the most foundational ones is the AUP, the acceptable use policy, that really says, this is what you're allowed to do as an employee, this is what you're not allowed to do. Where you run risk, just like with the data retention policy, is when that is not being managed consistently across the organization. certain employees are allowed to get away with more than other employees, those things. Incident response, that's critical. How often do you actually exercise your plan? Do you have appropriate run books and playbooks for a variety of different scenarios? Certainly minimally, foundationally, ransomware, phishing, lost or stolen device, compromised credentials, all of those things I think are really, really important. Contact information and vendor authorized personnel and emergency contact information in your incident response plan. If you're dealing with the DDoS as an example, do you have the right number to call the cable company or the telco and have them null route an IP that's offended? Are you authorized to make that request?
Getting playbooks, and you have legal playbooks.
Yeah.
Those-
Crisis communications, who's authorized to speak with law enforcement, all of these things. These are things that I think need to be addressed proactively up front. And then service management. The bane of everyone's existence are change requests, but they're really important. You start thinking about change requests with ephemeral assets, that's challenging. Here's a Kubernetes environment that was there for a couple of minutes and then it was taken down. And being able to track and manage those things accordingly. So just briefly going back through these, you look at this identity governance. What's reasonable from an identity governance, credential management, entitlements perspective, your assets, et cetera. As you go through each of those layers, all of those have really important implications for your security program. Questions or concerns just on kind of this administrative side of reasonable security or observations?
What's your take on training and user education?
I think it's imperative, absolutely imperative. And the problem is that it tends to be not funded. And we're all doing, 40, 50, 60-hour weeks. And so there's not a lot of free time on the calendar to take the time to do these things. But when I do like program reviews, I'll look at competencies and skills within the security team itself, as well as separate and distinct from that, a training for employees, like awareness training, those things.
What have you seen that's worked well? Phishing, simulations.
I think all of the above. I think it's an executive tone. So there's like phishing or text messages that are coming in, having a senior non-IT, non-security person send a message out, telling employees to be vigilant. That resonates. Of course, the employees should check and make sure that that wasn't a spoof message, But it boggles the mind how frequently. I mean, that's where companies do get popped. Is somebody feeling susceptible? They fall to social engineering.
That's still number one.
Absolutely. We call that pulling a stamper. Damn, tough crowd. I'm a walking material weakness.
So if I Google,
Yeah.
the Stanford.
There, it's all over them. Lucy.
What's your experience? What have you seen happening with now companies are super decentralized because everything is SaaS, everything is, so there's not really a centralized.
There's no perimeter.
Exactly. So I haven't seen who is taking the responsibility of making sure that all those SaaS applications, all those systems are meeting all the IT and security control.
This is where I go back to that notion of like collaboration with different departments, with HR, IT, line of business, compliance, audit, all the different stakeholders in the organization. They need to understand that security is entity-wide. It's not just a CISO and his or her team. It requires collaboration. Absent that collaboration, if it's just, vendor risk management, that's a security issue. Credentials, that's a security issue. Those are stillborn. They've already lost the battle in many cases. It's really tough. So, but the collaboration, you can't leave it to chance. It has to be literally, you have to either demand your way to the table or find creative ways to do that. So, Neil, sir.
Well, you're running across, so kind of similar to what you were saying earlier about, the United States, we're the most litigious society out there. We're also, when it comes to organizational, we have a tendency to be very siloed.
Yep.
That collaboration is almost like a fantasy.
Yeah. Or it might be viewed as competition you know,
Oh, yeah, that's it. Oh, how dare you talk about my territory, you know, that type of thing. So what do you see have you had, you know, what methods have you seen to help with that?
I think fundamental,
Or I thought that you're agreed. Or the opposite. Oh, is the vendor responsibility? Oh, is the.
Oh, yeah,
the-
everybody's always-
responsibility, and
yeah.
we have, you know,
Yeah.
lots of
Exactly.
responsibility, So.
Yep.
I think every one of us in this profession, in this room, we have to learn the business. You know, at the end of the day, our job is to enable and protect the business and make it more resilient when confronting different forms of risk. And so I think it's imperative that we're out meeting with different stakeholders, and not trying to convey what we want to tell them. That will naturally occur at some point, but it's really understanding what's important. And as a quick aside, I'd like to note that only Neil and I got the Hawaiian shirt memo. So it's pretty damn embarrassing for the rest of you, but we'll deal with it.
There's another pair there with clouds.
Yeah. There we go. Exactly.
I will do better next month.
Okay, but that should have been sent out maybe, you know, ISACA wide globally.
Just
Yeah.
One about awareness training.
Yeah, there we
That's where
go.
we get short. Yeah.
So now let's get into a little bit more of kind of our realm. So we had kind of those,
I'm just gonna say
Yeah.
one thing, just to try and dovetail, because listening to you say this is like listening to a recording of myself. And trying to, but for like what Neil's describing and what Lucy's describing, those are culture issues. They're not necessarily technical issues. It's how do you get to that culture? If you can get there on a fundamental level, you've got something you can build off of.
Yeah.
So to your point, however you can get there,
yeah,
you know, is the goal. But that's fundamentally what we're trying to modify. So the door can open to do all of, to proceed
yep,
with everything we've done.
And I'll just go on top of that. I mean, truly speaking the language of business. So we have a new CISO and she doesn't have a security background, but she speaks risk. And so and it's a little easier. So in industrial applications, she came in and said, if we're down, you know, we have one mine site that goes down for an hour, that's $400,000. Right. And so like speaking the language of business and being able to take what she knows about the costs or the production, and the dollar amount, and that gets the attention of everybody. And then safety, right? And then there's safety that comes with it too. And in mining, that is the number one, you know, thing you're thinking about is. So it's also being able to speak the language of all of like, what is everybody's concern? Like what risks are they worried about? What opportunity can we contribute to? And so she got most of the funding for
that makes good sense.
people and technologies, and the board was listening to that language, so. I definitely-
To your point, you're absolutely spot on. And by the way, Bill has the best damn ringtone, you know. I could use more cowbell. What's missing in most of our security programs are cowbells. But to your point, there is a tool, and we'll do a little show of hands here. Who's done a BIA, a business impact analysis for their company? That should be obligatory. Because you can find out dependency analysis, dependencies on vendors, on locations, on skills and staffing levels and competencies and technology stacks and everything. And to your point, to be able to go in and start quantifying what is literally a minute of downtime or an hour of downtime. I'm ex AT&T. I grew up in the telco space when I started, more moons than I'll admit. If AT&T had a network outage, that was literally tens and 20s and 30s of millions of dollars per minute for the organization. I mean, it was ingrained. You had to have 5 nines of availability. Just out of curiosity, how many minutes of downtime are 5 nines of availability per year? So there you go. Scott gets it. Yep. But it depends where you put the decimal.
Yeah.
Oh. It's like 5.49 or something along those lines. It's less than 6 minutes a year. So when we built out systems, because we knew the criticality of the network, you had to design in fault tolerance. So component level fault tolerance, geographic fault tolerance, et cetera. So everything was designed for failure with the notion that nothing, ultimately will bring down the network. Now, the way we do it, we're looking at a component level. Typically, it's software. You see challenges with S3. Somebody did a software update. Speaking of which, applications. Segue. Pen testing. Is that reasonable? Required. Okay, you've got 100 applications in your portfolio, and it's $30,000 to do a pen test as a hypothetical. Which ones do you do? Which ones don't you do? What happens if the one that didn't get on that cycle get tested? This is the risk that we're facing. Nielsen.
The reason goes back to, bring regulation to it. In our world, you don't have a choice. We have to do pen tests.
Yeah.
Regardless of what it costs.
This is COGS. This is cost of goods sold, if you think about it in many ways. But now, so you think about pen testing, whether it's black box, gray box, white box, whatever the methodology is, then you start thinking a little bit deeper into the integrated development environment and the stack. Is static application testing reasonable? Dynamic? Runtime? Are you looking at your API endpoints? Are they inventoried? Are you exploring business logic exploits with your APIs? Yes, sir.
Yeah, the other problem is that, when you think of compliance, you're saying, well, we have to do this annually. But
Yeah.
The real test comes in, you do a continuous type of test.
That's exactly right.
You're going in there and you're like, hey, the guys fixed it last month, but then you go back and the same problem came back up again. But
Yep.
now there's more problems. Continuous will help you get the reality of
Yeah.
what's really going on versus just in that one.
You bring up a great point, is like temporal consideration. So is a point in time audit these days reasonable versus continuous?
Continuous for a bug bounty.
Yeah, I mean, things of that nature. There's a lot going on with applications. I mean, this is a very specialized domain. All these things need to be thought of. The White House National Cybersecurity Strategy emphasized SBOMs. Do your applications have software bill of materials? Are you looking at software composition analysis in third-party libraries and open source code that's coming in? There's nothing wrong per se with open source code, but did you look at the provenance of it? Who's behind the community that's contributing? These things are really important. Memory, input validation, fuzz testing, linting, all the different things that go into looking at an application and evaluating whether or not it is secure. Is that reasonable? Your databases, are you doing activity monitoring? Are your, database analysts and administrators going in with unique credentials, not their day-to-day credentials, when they're making changes to the environment? So again, at the database layer, what's reasonable? And that's the operative question. I'm going to be a broken record. I always am, but I'm going to be more so today. It's literally asking that question. Would it be reasonable not to have that? If it is reasonable not to have it, that decision ideally isn't made in isolation. It's one that's made with, multiple stakeholders kind of opining on it. So
This is say is because what I would think is reasonable compared to the business owner thinking was reasonable.
Yeah.
It could be two different things.
it goes back to her point there on, if we have downtime, it costs X, or safety, So, I mean, look at, and let's not fool ourselves, folks. Right now, the quality of our software is killing people. Unequivocally. Look at Boeing. They had 2 birds drop out of the sky because of software issues with the Max. That killed people. Was that reasonable? This is what's going on, is as our society becomes more and more dependent on algorithms and applications, our ability to literally kill people, especially in healthcare and other kind of critical infrastructure, is going to increase accordingly. So
Yeah, and even like on the other couple slides back where you had APIs. The gentleman we had presenting a couple of months ago was sharing that roughly 85% of traffic on the internet comes through APIs. So
Yeah.
we've got third parties, vendors, and everything in trying to analyze where data is coming from if our organization
Exactly.
participates in.
Like rate limited APIs. If you have an API that's designed to extract information from the database, is it rate limited? Should it be?
Right.
You know, could that API endpoint and its ecosystem detect, you know, kind of nefarious type activity, things of that nature? A good example in that, and I think it was either on CISO Tradecraft or one of those podcasts, but there was a discussion about API security where someone found a foreign exchange currency API that instead of being like 1.12 equals $1, they carried it out a little bit further, even though we express currency, you know, to 2 digits, as it were. And so what that person was able to do is just use the API with its business logic, and they made thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars every day exploiting the business logic of it.
That's the office space, right?
I think so. I don't remember. Yeah. Based on my shirt, it wasn't me that did. So, you know, databases, all of these things, communication strings between your application and your database. Encrypted? Open? Well, it should be encrypted.
Depends
Oh,
on what data you're talking.
well,
This is AT&T, like,
yeah.
this is them.
Oh, yeah. It's decidedly challenging.
Yeah, but you go
Well,
back
I'm
to
so sorry, buddy.
encryption. So the adversary bypasses one of your controllers. You need it encrypted or not?
It depends. It's like VPN. It just kind of hides adversarial behavior.
So he bypassed your authentication.
Yeah.
You encrypt it.
Then you start, well, if you bypassed it, he's already there.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So why is encryption? So you gotta balance it too. right?
Yeah, no, it's about, these are all choices. I mean, this is effectively Sophie's choice. It's a horrible way to describe it, but you know, I love certain controls more than others. You know, I love certain applications a lot more than others, and some applications aren't going to be as secure as I would like them to be because I don't have the resources to do so.
We do have a question from online. To what you were talking about, that people are dying.
Mhm.
Do you know if there's any data of people dying in hospitals? due to breaches?
I don't know currently. I know we have more than anecdotal evidence because of ransomware attacks and patients in ambulances being redirected. I will tell you this, my next door neighbor has had a cardiac issue when Scripps went down with ransomware, showed up at Scripps Encinitas and they couldn't get his medical record. You know, he survived. But, you know, there are instances around that. Ted Harrington, if you guys know him locally from independent security evaluators, they did research probably 7-8 years ago, may have been even more than that, with the simple question: could a doctor kill a patient, or could a threat actor use a doctor or a nurse or the devices in a healthcare facility to kill patients? And it was extraordinarily easy, you know, and that report is still out there. If you look at like ISE, their analysis on it is fascinating. It's not that difficult.
Right, well, if you think about the security going into remote devices.
Yeah.
there's-
And healthcare budgets, you know, are they really big or are they really, really small? They're small.
One thing that I've seen, especially in healthcare, is application. Application compatible
Yeah,
to an app that doesn't support, well, in the old days, service packs,
yeah.
right? So what do you do?
Or you have a GE device and the maintenance requires that you use their password, which is well known, published in their manual, you know, those sorts of things. I'll pick this up a little bit high level. Your OS and your endpoints, you know, is EDR reasonable? How about mobile device management? Would it be reasonable to have an endpoint without MDM? That's a good question to ask. Yeah, I mean, we lose them.
Well, before COVID and after COVID.
Yeah.
It's very different.
But it's a great question though. You know, we lose devices a lot. And those devices tend to have a lot of information on them. You know, that's your perimeter, if you will. It's the laptop and, you know, walking material weaknesses like me. This is what you got. You know, so would it be reasonable not to have a mobile device management capability on your endpoints? Should that device be encrypted? Should the encryption be centrally managed? How quickly should those keys be rotated, or how frequently should they be rotated? How do you connect into it? You know, if you're connecting back into things, is it now VPN? Is it SASE? You know, secure access service edge, those types of activities. Admin rights. You know, that third one from the bottom there, that's probably one of the better controls we can all implement. You know, that's an important one. Containers, you know, you think about like your Kubernetes environments and microservices, how well are those locked down? You know, this is becoming more and more frequent for a number of organizations. The network, NAC, is network access control reasonable? Would you let a device on that doesn't have the most current service pack or doesn't have an appropriate EDR tool on it or a certificate? Is it reasonable not to have that? These are really critical things. Segmentation in the network. And this is a pain in the butt because we're not the folks building out the networks. It's infrastructure and operations in most cases. And our job is to effectively kind of understand what the risk profile is in the network and help them make decisions around that. One of the things clearly, as you see, well, I'm not going to bash a vendor on a call. But at RSA, one of the guys that I co-presented with, Pearson Clare, super smart guy, one of the major firewall vendors, not the more common one, but a decent one. He described it as the gift that keeps on giving, and he works in IR. You know, these applications, this is something that's really critical. Our security applications run with trusted privileges in most cases. So if that application is exploited, now what happens? You know, SolarWinds was interesting because it was ubiquitous. You know, a lot of companies use it. It manages the network. That download, that trusted process, if you will, to do the updates is there. But we assume that the code coming from our security vendors is good, high quality, secure code. Is it? It may not be. Firmware, things of that nature, your protocols, what's being allowed. Should you trust your network? Open question. Yeah. I don't know if I trust the network. I don't know if I trust the device. I sure as hell don't trust me. You know, what should we be trusting? So these are really critical questions. Same thing with storage, levels of encryption, like encrypted drives, things of that nature. It's where when I started off, you had a lot more emphasis on stuff that was on-prem, but now everything is, you know, kind of block and object-based storage up in the cloud. But even still, are you configuring it correctly? Are you using well-architected principles? AWS, in the case of AWS, is Trusted Advisor to look for known security issues. All of this stuff is very important. Encryption, media, all of that. Very critical. And then in the old, there used to be a thing called a data center. And in it, you had, you know, HVAC and systems. And one of the things that came into play in most cases, like when you see a data center go down, what's the typical root cause of a data center crashing? Power, but what about the power? The batteries. So commercial power, if you build a data center correctly, you assume that your commercial power is your backup power and your primary are your generators. That's your primary source of power, but you run on the backup, the utility feed that comes in. When it goes, you fail over via automatic transfer switches onto your generators. And in that interim, between the time when you've lost commercial power and those gen sets come on and the frequencies get aligned and you start pushing power down into the data center, what holds it are the UPSs. And inside those UPSs are banks of batteries. And the problem is that the bank of batteries consist of multiple distinct separate batteries. If one in those lines doesn't have the impedance or it's got other issues with it, it brings down the entire line and the data center falls. And that's what ends up happening. Battery monitoring, would that be reasonable? Again, these are the types of things that I think we have to kind of take a look at. So, you know, the challenge as this talk, I hope is conveyed, is there is an enormous amount of operational complexity that goes into security and IT operations. And that complexity, in many cases, is driving us to make a lot of very difficult decisions, very difficult prioritizations. And I loved your point earlier about kind of the business. That's one of the most critical ways to do that. You know, does it impact safety? Yes or no? Does it impact the business? Yes or no? If so, how much? That's where we spend our time in prioritization. So again, just going through these, looking at these, and you can add a tremendous amount of more detail in here. But again, the question is, would it be reasonable if some of these capabilities were not there? So some final thoughts on this. I think what's absolutely critical is that organizations have an identified accountable party for the security program, kind of a CISO or someone in that ilk to be able to do that. I think it's absolutely critical that the organization formalize its security strategy in a target operating model. That's really critical. We choose to insource these capabilities. We choose to co-source these. We choose to outsource those, but those are actual decisions that are reviewed and analyzed. In my book, I talk about the notion of declaring war on ambiguity. What is it that we don't know that we should know? Why don't we know it? Ask that question religiously. Ask it everywhere. What is it that we're not doing that we should be doing? Why aren't we doing it? Those good open-ended questions are really important. Pick a good framework. I'm a huge fan of NIST. I think the cybersecurity framework is more than appropriate for the vast majority of the organizations that are out there. Start building out your metrics and key risk indicators. And there's really kind of 3 different types of KRIs that are available. There's coverage KRIs, X of Y, if you will. There's operational risk reduction. That's like how you configure the device. Default deny is an example of an ORR, an operationally risk reducing KRI. Percentage of devices or networks or services or whatever that have default deny. And then personnel. Dave's my boss. He gives me 6,000 hours worth of work to do in a year. Well, there's going to be something breaking. You know, do we have the right people in the right numbers with the right skills and competencies and tooling to do the work that is associated with our agreed to plan? Simple one, a calendar. Just go through, build a nice clean calendar. So if we want to do scans or assessments or reviews, whatever it is, that it's on a calendar that the team knows about and it's resourced. So you don't have something just show up, you know, like let's do credential reviews for SAP and it's December 30th and it's due in the year. Put in the appropriate time to make sure that those activities, and it's a good way to do kind of your labor hour budget for those activities.
It's a good way to stagger.
Absolutely. Yeah. To know what needs to be done and all that. The BIA, I think, is foundational. That's a religious document for me. You know, Old Testament, New Testament, Quran, Torah, whatever. No, the BIA. Yeah. I would hope all of them, but I think many don't. I would say it's probably less than 20%. I don't see a lot of them, you know, when I go into organizations. And they don't need to be complicated. These things could start as a OneNote, you know, file. Just start putting in, what are our core applications? What are the, you know, how does the company derive enterprise value? Do I know that? You know, what are the most material risks? What are the kind of portfolio risks that we're managing? Those things. And then use risk registers. These are really powerful documents or spreadsheets in this case. They don't need to be complicated, but here's the 10 risks that we think are most important. How are we managing against those? Do we have visibility around that? And then just validate the hell out of everything. You know, it's inappropriate to delegate and not go back and validate that this activity is being done. So, some recommended reading, Rick Howard, he came out with a book not that long ago called Cybersecurity First Principles. He's a huge advocate of zero trust. And I like this ultimate metric here is risk forecasting with the core metric, the probability of a material impact within the next 3 years. And there's a debate like fair and risk quantification and things of that nature. His view is just do a back of the envelope. You know, if you look at it statistically, we tend to get relatively good responses by going through and just kind of doing back of the envelope estimates around what materiality would look like and which systems. But really, really good book. Couple others, Adam Shostak's book on threat modeling. I don't know how many folks have read that, or I talk about it all the time. It's, yeah, part of it. Yeah. I mean, it's a good sized book. It's, you know, you get your money's worth. But threat modeling and stride, this is something that I think we should all be focused in on doing. And it doesn't, again, like a BIA, these don't need to be overly formalized or even run books, you know, in our incident response plans. This is stuff that you can put into like a OneNote and just simply go stride, you know, spoofing, tampering, repudiation, information disclosure, denial of services, and elevation of privileges. What are we doing to prevent those? You know, and then you have metrics related to those, KRIs to look at those. I'm a huge fan of Andrew Stewart's book, A Vulnerable System. It is just an absolutely great book. And I owe these two guys lunch, whether they like it or they don't, or three guys now, lunch, whether they like it or not. It is just an absolutely great, great book. Singh's The Code Book, A History of Cryptography. It's old, it's from 2000, but it reads like it was written in the last, you know, couple of years or so. He even spoke about quantum computing in 2000, which is obviously, it's been on the radar for a long time. Sunil Yu's Cyber Defense Matrix. I strongly recommended that Dylan take a look at that. And then obviously Schneier on security or anything that he writes is really, really good. And then I might be biased, but these are also decent books. I'll go back. So with that, all questions, concern. Boy, did that drop like a.
I think you already, everyone already start hearing, terrifying news about the artificial intelligence.
Yeah.
How they are already start making the voices of the CEO and legal transfers. So what do you see so far? Companies already start working on that, or they think that it's in the future?
I think there's a handful of things that we want to be cognizant of. One is disinformation, you know, so using these large language models to produce detail that is perceived to be kind of factual and well vetted, and it isn't. And so there's a lot of that activity going on. A stronger issue that I see is that these things are run on algorithms, you know, any number of different algorithms, and those tend to be kind of black box calculations. There's not a lot of transparency around it. So, you know, if you put into a general ledger 2 + 2, it should come out as 4. You know, now we don't know if 2 + 2 is coming out at like 4.01 or things of that nature. So the algorithms are challenged. And we're in a society where those are intellectual property. It's kind of like fracking. You know, they'll put different types of chemicals down into the ground to be able to extract oil and natural gas. And those chemicals, the combinations of them, if you will, are fundamentally the intellectual property of that company that's using it. You know, that's their intellectual property, justifiably so, but it also may contaminate drinking water. We don't know. You know, there's instances like that. So you have companies that have invested hundreds of millions of dollars in building out these platforms and the algorithms that run it. But as a society, we don't have any transparency. And then what's worrisome to me, and this is very important from an ISACA perspective, is essentially we're not building that next gen of auditors that have that kind of quantitative, I hope that isn't me, that next gen of auditors that have that quantitative knowledge to be able to go in and review these things. So that's worrisome. And then I think if you look at it, our adversaries are clearly doing everything that they can to take advantage of you know, these models without a shadow of a doubt. They're clearly going after it. course, we've given so many things to them already on a clear platter, it seems like. So, I would say caveat emptor, And I mean, at the end of the day, I was involved with the company. A lot of this is like cluster analysis. Like if you go back and you read the code book, the Arab code breakers in like the 1400s, they were just doing frequency analysis. C followed by H happens how many times, or T followed by H happens how many times. What a lot of those large language models are doing is they're just simply looking at these massive bodies of words and seeing correlations around how often they get used together, and that gets brought out. And then we kind of go through and we assess the fidelity of the response over and over, and they get better and better over time. The problem is, and in fact, it was your colleague that gave that great discussion here last year, I think, is when the large language models are not using like external data, but their own data to create data. And then you don't know whether or not that loop is high quality. Questions or concerns, other observations?
I know you mentioned a couple times, you didn't specifically call out, years ago, a few years back, California, now it's not a regulation, but they were saying that CIS top 20 is
MFA.
reasonable security.
Yeah.
That's what they defined it as. And encryption at risk.
Yep, and MFA. Yep.
So you have, and you mentioned CIS a few times. Do you still see that as a prevalent? I mean, I know you mentioned CSF and NIST, and
I think there's a fundamental challenge with the critical security controls, is that it's viewed primarily from a technical perspective. It's a absolutely great list of prescriptive controls. What was really important from NIST 1.1 to 2.0, and they really just kind of relabeled some of the things, is this emphasis on governance. And NIST emphasizes that business context, those things tend to be very important. So,
yeah, so one of the things, what's reasonable? What's the risk?
Yeah.
Determining risk determines what I think is reasonable.
Yeah. And you have a luxury, like in your space, you're mandated to do things. If you're in healthcare, you follow HIPAA,
There's certain things I don't have a choice.
Yeah.
But even when implementing an administrative or technical control, I have leeway. How in-depth that is.
Like in CMMC, so with respect to controlled and classified information and federal contract information, which is based off of NIST 800-171 R3, they have what they call these ODPs, organizationally defined parameters. So the Department of Defense isn't saying that your password needs to be N number of characters long with this degree of complexity. It's an organizationally defined parameter. And so people were kind of proverbially freaking out because, well, what should we put in there? Well, it's an organizationally defined parameter. So you have to kind of think through. And I think this is what the takeaway from my view is, we have a hell of a lot of work to do in a relatively short period of time. Security will be front and center from a litigation perspective for the foreseeable future. We see this in like cyber liability insurance policies. I mean, very bluntly, if you think about false claims and insurance fraud, think about the underwriting that goes into cyber liability. Half of us that work in security weren't involved in literally the submission of the application. And think about the fidelity of the statements there. Or look at NIST and 800-171 and the Department of Defense, and everything that's been submitted that organizations are following 871 and 171A, the assessment guide and its determination statements, those strike me as False Claims Act. Well, there's statements being made to our Department of Defense that companies are doing this. An auditor comes in and looks at it and goes, I don't see it. We got to get past that to a lot more kind of concrete. What it does boil down to is we have a massive, in my view, unfunded liability in the economy, that we have to up our game. We have to be able to do these things more prescriptively, more with higher levels of assurance, kind of run our security programs like a business, if you will, where there's good quantifiable data, KRIs, metrics that are reportable to various stakeholders at different levels so that that assurance goes up. And then the executive team and the board have to make decisions. We choose to accept this risk or we choose not to.
Yeah.
But it's their decision.
Yeah, actually on that, that's what I was gonna touch on, because, you know, I love asking the question of what is reasonable security.
Yeah.
And it's gonna be unique per organization and per environment, but whether there's regulatory drivers or just culture within the organization, whenever I'm working with somebody, at the same time, you're saying, okay, you can tell me what you think is reasonable, but I also need to know who owns this risk.
Yeah. Most times we don't own it.
Yeah, we don't. We're more than.
We've accepted ownership, and I think we've really screwed ourselves over by doing that.
I remember some few years back, you were doing a presentation, you said exactly that. You were making decisions as a CISO you shouldn't be, but you had no choice.
Yeah. You know, and I don't think these decisions should be made at an individual person either. So it's not like I can delegate this to the CFO and have her make the decision. I think there are certain kind of really high level decisions that require collective input.
Isn't the challenge communicating the risk to the business?
Yeah.
Trying to justify a budget to resolve their risk, it's really challenging.
It is. This is going back to her point earlier about being able to quantify the business impact. That's foundational. And the problem is that we're not, as a profession and as a role, generally speaking, we haven't been trained in this stuff. You know, we don't speak in terms of internal rate of return on return on capital employed or any of these things. That's not our normal language. It's like, oh, there's a CBE that needs attention. You know.
Speaking of the BIA, I've been in situations where people just lie.
Yeah.
They ignore the tier level of the application.
Mm-hmm.
How do you get around?
Everything's a snowflake. My apps are mission critical. Don't worry about hers. Those are not really that critical. There's that. I mean, I think this is why we've got to break out of the proverbial silos and get more people at the table. It's critical in my view, you know. And then ultimately, there's certain things that have to be arbitrated by the CEO, by the CFO, or the board of directors. You know. Other questions, concerns?
I have a question for the group, because it just kind of came to me, but do y'all think it'd be valuable if we did like a work group through the chapter, walking through a BIA?
I think, yeah, I would love that. Yeah.
Noted.
And I think like run books, BIAs, risk registers, this is really a crawl, walk, run. You know, it does not need to be complicated. Just, you know, start with bare minimum and then iterate. Same thing with playbooks, you know, step 1, step 2, step 3. These, you know, we're not looking for perfection. What we're trying to do is get the organization to think about these issues. I'm a huge fan of OneNote, you know, or whatever tool that you use. Just start putting stuff in there, you know. Scott.
Train general. Like the number one control. How do you make it not a compliance checkbox? Because we, like, one of the trainings we do with an handful of security program online, tests with questions. You know, it just goes in one ear and out the other. How do you make it actually stick? Make it interesting?
Yeah.
Gamification. Like, I don't know. We do so much training that I know it's probably 10%.
I think what's interesting to me is we all live dual lives. You know, we're inherently bipolar. We work and then we have our personal life, and our personal life bleeds into our work and our work bleeds into our personal life. So many of us are the victims of identity theft, credit card compromise, things of that nature. I think to the extent that you can relate back some of the personal issues that we see as individuals, and how that impacts what we do at work is important. There's I'm biased, not this form of bias, but similarly biased. There's a book by Perry Carpenter called Transformational Security Awareness, and I had the opportunity to be kind of the technical editor of it. And he and Joanna Huisman, who I both worked at Gartner, are experts in this stuff. They live and breathe this literally every day. And it's to Dave's point earlier, it's almost like a cultural dynamic. You know, you either get it or you don't. And then if you don't, you know, there's the consequences. Not pushing employees out, but you get companies that really understand it. Like quality, saying we appreciate quality, but not doing the hard work to do quality work is just kind of asinine. And I think that's what's happening is you've got a lot of folks that have implemented programs to do a certain thing. To your point, Scott, earlier is, okay, I've got a requirement. There's a checklist here that I need to do, but it is real. You know, it's kind of in name only. And so I think it's important having the executive leadership team be engaged, getting messages out from the CEO or other key executives going, you know, listen, there's a lot of people trying to spoof me as your CEO, telling you to do these things. I'm telling you right now, I never do these. You know, you will not get a text from me asking for some Amazon, you know, gift cards because you're stuck in a meeting. You know, that stuff happens. Yeah.
With security awareness, what we found is like that is the easiest way to get buy-in from C-levels because it's always coming, either they're getting, right, either they're being spoofed. So you start showing them like, this is going out to people with your name on it. And that like, so CEO, he was like, more training, you know, I mean, that was like a mind blowing.
One thing that moved the needle. So a friend of mine just recently, he left a firm, but he went in and he built a deep fake on his CEO. And then he showed it to the CEO, and the CEO was telling employees to do things that were clear violations, AUP and the whole bit. And he goes, and then he presents it to the CEO, Dave, you're the CEO. And he goes, you know, so Dave, this took me about 10 minutes to put together. And I did this because I was in a hurry. If I would have spent a little bit more time, this would have been even higher fidelity, but it looks like you, it sounds like you, it mimics you. And it's telling employees to do this. This was not hard to do. And to be able to spoof your email and get a message in with that type of content.
It's done in 30 seconds.
Yeah.
ChatGPT.
Yeah. So those things that it goes back to that point, Scott, about trying to bring it back to the end of it, to the actual person. Yeah. Yep.
And I keep directing my team, so I heavily edit it before I put it up there, because they keep writing, you know, it's like work related. It's like, no, this is like
Personal.
in life.
Yeah.
This is what you do to protect yourself.
You almost need to market it.
Yeah.
Well, you have to have that.
Video stuff.
We have the mandatory.
Mhm.
We do the self-issue, which I'm not a huge fan of. But then we also have, you know, the head of our, red team, we have an internal red team. She will give presentations in the mind of a hacker.
Yeah.
And, you know, and that's as a video recording that comes out. If you, there's a vendor that has, I'm not gonna plug anybody, but there's a vendor that has the inside man videos that they do those. And so, but it's beyond the check marks. The check marks, yeah, the CBT, that's gonna get lost with the fire extinguisher, CBT and everything else. But the marketing stuff is what people latch on to. I'm looking at
Haiku and things like that. 'Cause
Yeah.
I really think the gamification. and
Yeah.
the
Gamification, that works.
Probably the best thing you.
Hey, Scott, one of the other things I've done that's at least resonated well are tabletop exercises. You keep them small, you can pick whatever topic you want, but if you bring the people in, whatever the size group is, you can know going in what level of pain you want to walk them through on it. But when you do that, you can start having the one person go, well, I don't know. And then they ingest it differently than conventional training.
Yeah. I made a comment on like the checklist, and we use the term checklist somewhat pejoratively, but they're actually very helpful tools. Like a tool Gawande's the checklist manifesto. You know, I drank that Kool-Aid a long time ago. So, but yeah, checklists are important because they validate these things. But it's kind of this notion, is it perfunctory? You know, are we really doing this? Or are we just kind of ticking the boxes? And I think that's where we need to get it at a more visceral level and being able to relate it.
You've actually done, you do annual privilege checks.
Yeah.
I think people aren't any better, like, my people scan for different policy violations, and like, hey, you said your privilege and your regular account password the same, so it's like, why do you think you have a such an account?
Because you told me to.
The purpose of the, you know, it's like.
Exactly.
There's some stuff on.
Oh, okay. And I think Dave's got a couple of questions.
Well, one was a comment, and I'll see if you can guess who said this. So Matt is really saying that audit is an important part of the game to know what is represented / asserted actually exists.
Is that Tim?
Yeah.
Tell Tim I said, hey. No, but yeah, going back to that point, validate, validate, validate. Assurance is predicated on validation. You know, if not, it's a leap of faith.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah, he's not wrong. And then I want to scroll down, but it's just, there's a whole lot of thank you, great session.
Oh,
And platitudes.
what do they know? So, well, thank you guys very much. I enjoyed this. So thank you.
Great job as always. Thank you. Thank you. Man.
Do you want me to tear down the session or?
Yeah.
I'm just going to hit in.
Yeah. Yeah, and then